Okay, folks, trigger warning. If you are not interested in talking about essay, then you should leave. I didn't tell anyone about the essay that occurred when I was a kid. I buried it. A lot of people bury it because their systems can't handle it. But before I buried it, I didn't tell anyone because I knew they wouldn't believe me. And I was right. I was smart. And I did the best thing for me. So these stories that go around the internet of all of these men who take advantage of children, potentially including the Republican nominee. These stories set me on fire. They are very, very hard for me to sit with. And the way that people look the other way, that's the hardest part about it. Because honestly, at a certain point, what happens to your body is something that you can turn off. Our bodies are compassionate. We have a way of shutting down. But what happens to the safety that we lose when we have to go away, when we have to push parts of us inside, never to be seen until we're strong enough to see them, and we look around and we realize that we have to do that because we're not in an environment of people who are compassionate or who are going to believe you. We're not in an environment of people who want to take care of children at all costs. That's a very hard thing for a child to learn. I think our children already know that based on how we treat them around gun violence, but this is an added awful thing that a lot of girls face. So the fact that the Epstein documents have been released, a whole nother trove of them, and the fact that that drummed up the other documents that had been previously released that were in themselves quite damning, but those kind of dropped out of the spotlight, and now, here's a new trove, and I don't see any of the mainstream media going there. And I don't see anybody going there except brave people on X and on TikTok. And thank goodness for them. Maybe there are people who also had to go away and hide parts of themselves because they wouldn't be able to handle it if they came out and people wouldn't have believed them. People don't make this shit up. They don't make this shit up. Especially when you're talking about somebody who has power. I didn't talk about the man who violated me because he had power. And the only power that he had was in my world. He had power within his family. He had power within the neighborhood because he was very well liked. So I didn't want to go against him because I didn't want to take away people's love for him. I wasn't going to be the person to ruin that. Now, somebody like Donald Trump, who has a loyal following, of people who are pretty reactive and not really willing to see the truth about that guy. That, I imagine, coming out with any allegation against a guy like that is so freaking hard. And I frankly don't know that I would ever be able to do it. And I'm somebody who's pretty strong. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm willing to say shit. So the fact that women talked about experiences that they had when they were 12, 13-year-old girls who had been taken advantage of, girls who had been taken advantage of in ways that indicated that probably they didn't have a lot of people at home who were really clocking where those kids were and what was going on with them. And yet they were willing to come out and say it. The reason you come out and say something like that, at least for me, the reason why I came out and said it millions of years later was because I couldn't live with the thought that I hadn't said it at the time and potentially saved somebody from going through it. Somebody like our Republican nominee doesn't stop that kind of shit. That's lifelong. That kind of need for power, that kind of need to dominate people doesn't go away. It's not like, the 10th woman, then it's satiated and it's done. You don't need to do it again. I am sure that there are so many more women than we have heard come forward. And, I think that's true for all of them. All of the ones who take advantage in the ways that somebody like him has, somebody like Epstein has. So the fact that these women were willing to come forward and talk and had to back out because their lives were threatened or their families were threatened, I understand that. When I released my first gun violence video and it got a big showing and it went around the world and I got hateful comments from thousands and thousands of gun extremists talking about awful things that they hoped happened to me and my family, I suddenly felt like I was an irresponsible mom. and that I had crossed the line and I never should have said anything and I was way beyond my boundaries and blah, blah, blah. And it threw me for a loop until I came back into my body and said, fuck that. I'm not going to take that shit. But if I hadn't been in California, I don't know that I would have kept going, frankly. If I had been in a deep red state, I think I would have erred on the side of caution. So the women who have come forward and said this shit, whether they said it years and years ago, whether they retracted it, I don't care. There's truth there. There's truth, and there's truth corroborated there. Even if a fraction of it actually happened in the way that they remembered, the granular details of it. Even if they didn't have the words to describe what he did, but all they know is that he took advantage of them, is that he was violent and he was cruel with them. Any bit of that is true, that should be enough. But in our country, that's not enough. We had a jury of his peers say that he was guilty of sexual assault. They decided, yeah, this is true. And they found him guilty. And then his followers tried to soften that by saying he wasn't guilty of the R word. He was just guilty of the SA situation, as though there is a huge distinction between the two. And then the judge had to drop in and say, you know what, this actually does qualify as the R word. But even that little crack in the veneer was enough for all of his followers to climb in there and not believe it and act like this woman made that shit up because it couldn't possibly be real, even though the jury said it was. That's how far people will go in this country to not believe things. Imagine these women thinking that nobody was going to believe them. Nobody was going to believe them when they were kids. Nobody was going to believe them when they were adults. And they had to do the thing to keep them safe. I know what that feels like, and that's an awful feeling. And it's not a feeling that we should have to feel. And so I would like for all of us to get a little more comfortable with talking about that shit, because it's not stuff that we should avoid, because it's insidious. And trust me, it's there. All of the nastiness that has been attributed to that man should be attributed to him, and even more. And I'm never going to change my mind about that. I know I'm going to get a lot of mad comments of people who cannot imagine that the Orangina Pervalicious Felonious Schlumper McPhee would ever do anything to make a woman feel bad, even though they've had enough examples for fucking 10 lifetimes. Because that means they would have to give something up. Because that means they would have to give up some fantasy that they feel like they really need in order for their world order to make sense, at the expense of all the people who they are tossing aside in order to keep that fantasy alive. This stuff is hard to talk about. I don't know if I just talked myself into a circle, but I know that I got some shit off my chest, and I thank you for listening. And if you're going to comment, I would appreciate if you do so from the vantage point of compassion for a person who experienced a horrible thing in her life and who hasn't been able to talk about it until she got to be way, way older, way farther on in her life. Thanks, guys. Love ya.